Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to be going over Material UI forums as well as combining these Material UI forums with a library known as Formik. This was actually given to me as a suggestion from my last video by, and I'm sorry I'm going to butcher your name, Danigel. Daniel, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but sorry for that. But yeah, pretty much we're going to go over how to use Formik with Material UI, what it is if you're not familiar with it, why it's useful. And I also want to say thank you so much for everyone who commented on my last video where I asked for some direction on the channel after Material UI was done. I really appreciate it. I read every single one of these. I love the suggestions. And as I always say, if you find value in this video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment. I try to read every single comment and I love interacting with you guys and the ideas you guys put forward. I wouldn't be able to do this without you guys. So let's jump straight into what Formik is. Essentially, Formik is a library, a wrapper that goes around Material UI text fields and other Material UI input components that makes creating forms with form validations and form inputs and submissions a lot easier than it would be normally with Material UI. If we look at the Material UI text field component, which is pretty much where the majority of this stuff comes from, you'll see there are a lot of different types of props you can pass into their text field, and you can make your input look very different and can control a lot of things. But in terms of form validation and actually creating a fully functional form, they don't really give that much help when it comes to doing that. And you'll see here, for example, validation is one big example. They have a prop for validation, but this prop will pretty much only change the way the component looks, as in making the title in red, having a red underline, etc., etc. There's no real logic that allows you at the end of a form when you click submit to know whether or not a element in that form has been submitted correctly. For example, if you have a form number, you have to build all the logic to check whether or not that that phone number is in a valid format by yourself. And that's where Formik comes in. So I've been using Formik for a little bit and it's not too complex once you get the hang of it. I don't think their documentation honestly does it justice. As you can see here, they have like a quick start, and in the quick start and the getting started guide, pretty much they will have examples of all the different ways you can use it for sort of the different Material UI libraries. And really quickly, let me explain what Formik really does. Essentially, when you are creating a form, at the beginning of the form, you are going to have a Formik component at the top. And this will be sort of like a provider where it provides values for any other Formik component that is nested within it. Then within that Formik, and I'll explain all of this stuff, it looks really complicated, but I'll explain it in a bit. Within all of that stuff, you actually have all your text fields. And your text fields, what they will do is they will take in a component, and that component is a Material UI component. So essentially this wraps around whatever Material UI component you pass through it, which also means if you are using this with Material UI, you are going to want to import Material UI components in most cases into your application and pass it into the Formik component. So that's why when you're seeing the installation guide, you'll see here that when they show you installation, not only are you installing Formik and Formik's Material UI wrapper, but you're also installing Material UI core. That's also why they want you to install Material UI lab and Material UI the Formik Material UI lab, because lab will come with certain components that if you want to wrap Formik around, you will need it in order to use the Formik Material UI lab component for it, and I'll show you examples of this. So just to clear that up, that was one of my biggest confusions when I was looking at this. I was like, if this is supposed to be a complete form, why are we still importing Material UI elements and passing them in? That's the answer to that. And you'll see here when we go to the quick start for lab, you can see in the lab they're importing the Autocomplete component, which if you're not familiar with Material UI lab is sort of a place where they have some experimental, not really fully stable components that Autocomplete happens to be a part of. And there are a couple other ones in there as well. And then finally, if you scroll down, you'll see that there's a picker, and this picker library has things like the Datepicker. So I'll show you an example of that soon as well. But that's pretty much the most that they give you when it comes to Material UI. And if you look on their GitHub, they have two links. One is to the documentation, which I just showed you. And sorry if I'm stuttering a bit, my nose is a bit stuffed up, but They have the material UI, their documentation over here, which is sort of like what I just showed you. It's not the best because you can't really see any examples and see how this correlates to anything, but they also have this code sandbox link, and this code sandbox link is really the gold mine when you're learning Formic, because right here they have an example of how every single possible thing you can implement with Formic works. For example, they have some text fields with emails, passwords, they have a remember me button slider, we got a select, we got a tags thing, we have a time picker, and we have date pickers, we have date time pickers, we have some toggle buttons, and finally we have autocomplete. And then you have the submit button. So this, I'm going to link to this code sandbox link in the description of this video. I highly recommend you guys check it out and play around with it. Now, I'm going to go through this entire file right now and explain how everything works so that it's crystal clear when you do get your hands on this code sandbox link of what is going on with this component. So, first of all, let's take a look at the imports. We can see here we have Formic, we have a bunch of things that they want from Material UI. We have a lot of other Formic things that they're importing, like I talked about before. They're importing the specific Formic wrapped around Material UI component. We have the one for just regular Material UI, we have the one for pickers, and we have the one for the lab. And then we have some other small things like format, align, justify icon, and stuff like that. That's just these icons that you see over here, so you don't have to worry too much about this stuff. And finally, they're wrapping everything in box. All that's really doing is applying some padding and some margin and applying some display styles to the actual component itself, just so it doesn't make everything look too bunched up. So now let's get over here. So these ranges, this is pretty much just specifically for this select component right here. You can see that they are just defining some constant values to use in this dropdown. So this isn't like a Formic specific thing. You don't have to really worry about that. If we scroll down here, we can sort of skip over this uppercasing text field. It's sort of self-explanatory. In the terms of this is just a helper function. I think it just helps with having the actual things inside of here get uppercased either on submit or being displayed. But it's not very important. In my opinion, I don't think they should have included in this code sandbox because I think it sort of clusters it, and if I were learning this for the first time, it would look pretty confusing. But let's jump into the actual meat of what Formic is. So you'll see here, when we have our first opening Formic tabs, Formic component, sorry, there are four main categories and props that are being passed in here that you need to know about. Number 1 is initial values, number 2 is validate, number 3 is on submit, and number 4 is the render. Now, each one of these plays a very important part when it comes to actually using Formic. The first one will set all the initial values of every single field inside of your application, inside of your form. So for example, we can see the email, the initial value here is set to nothing. But if I were to set it to like anthony@gmail.com, which I wish was my Gmail, you would see here when I reload the form, it'll just pre-populate the email field. And I'll show you how this correlates to the actual email form just by using this key over here in just a second. But the initial values is pretty straightforward. It's just all the initial values you want to see. If you're using date and date time stuff, I highly recommend passing in the initial value of new date. Otherwise, you'll have some, if you just pass in undefined or something, it'll look okay, but it'll have some really weird bugs. So, you should just copy new date unless specified otherwise, and there's some other date that they would want to pass in there for your default value. One application I like to use the Formic is whenever I have a form on a site, I will, the first time they fill out the form, it'll look empty. And then if they ever want to edit the form, it's really nice because I can pre-populate this field with all their previous answers from like Redux or something. So that's something really cool once you get a bit more familiar with Formic to try doing and testing out. So then we have validation. Now here is where all the actual validation comes out. So for example, if I were to, in this email address field, type in like ASDF and not have like, the valid email address where you have @ and stuff like that, then you'll see here I get an error that says invalid email. And you'll see here that the way it's structured, and there's only validation right now for emails, but the way it is structured is that we can see here This validation prop, once you open it up, is just pretty much, and this is in TypeScript, by the way, but if you wanted to use this in regular JavaScript, you just get rid of like the type identifiers and stuff like that. But essentially, what is happening here is you're just creating an object called errors, and within that errors object, you set the actual object key itself of, for example, email, so any one of these fields that you have, to be equal to whatever, depending on a condition. So in this case, if, and values is the variable that is actually keeping track of everything in the form. So that's why they're using values for everything here. Values is like where all of this information, once you type it in, is being stored, which is good because in contrast to, oh, I guess, by the way, this is what the uppercase thing does. Anything I type in here is uppercase. So it just makes it so that whatever you type in here gets converted to uppercase. So that's what this whole thing is doing. I realize now. Having typing all that stuff in. But essentially, with a regular form, you would have to keep track of every single thing, either via state or something like that, if you wanted to do validation. But here, they are doing that under the hood. So all you have to do is pass in this values option, this values parameter, and you'll be able to access everything. So in this first if statement, they're checking if values is null, then you set an error that it needs to be required. So you can see here, if I were to refresh the page, it won't show up initially. But if I were to click on it and then click away, that's when values will update, and that's when this validate will run, and that is when it'll show the error. So if I click it and click away, it goes into this if statement every time I click away from a field, and it'll be like, okay, if there's no if in the values object there's no email field, then create an error for email that says it is required, and you'll see that's where it comes up. So I can say something, I can change this to be like, if values.email.length is less than, let's say, 2 characters, then we'll say, you know, email has to be greater than 2 characters. And if I were to save that into refresh, you would see here that if I were to click away, I would still get the error because obviously undefined is less than 2 characters. But if I were to type like DE, I would get a different error that's invalid email address, and that is being caught here. So this is just some fancy regex that makes it so that you pretty much whatever they type in here has to be within email format. And if you're not too familiar with the regex, you can find regex for simple things like emails and passwords online. But essentially all this one is saying is that they have to have something, and then after that something they have to have an @ sign, and then afterwards they have to have a dot. Because that's how normal emails are formatted. You have some text, and then an @ sign, and then something else, and then a dot, and then something else after that. So anyways, reverting that back, now let's say we wanted to also make something for this password field. You can see I can type in anything and it sort of won't really trigger. But let's say we want to make it so that this password has to be at least 8 characters long. Well, now I can make a new if statement. So if values dot, and then find what key the password aligns to, which is just password, dot length is less than, let's say, 8. Then I can say errors.password equal password must be greater than 8 characters. And let's go ahead and save that. Refresh it. Because this is TypeScript, it's giving me a bit of a weird issue. But anyways, we can see here that it's still it'll still work. It'll still give that error, and you can check a lot of other things just like we showed up here. So yeah, it's just giving a red underline error issue because it's a TypeScript thing, but it'll still work. And I don't think a lot of people are going to be using Formic with TypeScript, if I had to guess from the viewers that watch these Material UI videos. So don't worry too much about that. Like I said, when you copy this into TypeScript, when you copy this into your JavaScript file, you can just delete anything that looks TypeScripty, like anything that tries to give a type to a variable like this. You can just go ahead and bop that out. I'm not sure what else in here uses TypeScript, but I don't think it's too much else. But yeah, so that is how the validation will work. So we've talked about initial values and validation. Now let's talk about this onSubmit. So this onSubmit is pretty simple. This will run whenever you click the submit button, obviously, if the validation and everything is completed, as in the validation doesn't return any errors like this. What they have in this default, and you'll see here values is getting passed in again. So if I implemented valid stuff, you'll see here when I click submit, what'll happen is we'll get this little, oops, why didn't this way? Let's just quickly get rid of the email validations for now, just for example's sake. We'll see here that we get a loading bar and then an alert that gives us a JSON of everything we passed in. So this is what the actual values object looks behind the scenes. So essentially, usually, and they do what's called set submitting to false. So this set submitting variable is only used for that, if you saw there, the loading bar, the linear progress that comes from Material UI. While set submitting is true, which pretty much is happening while this is being run, when you click the submit button, it'll show that little loading bar there, and it'll also have this in a set timeout so that the person can't. In a lot of forums, if you're building it from scratch at React, a problem you might have is like if someone like just spam clicks the submit button over and over again, it'll send a bunch of requests to your backend, for example. But here they set timeout here and set submitting to true because or they set the time, sorry, they set submitting to false so that when someone clicks this, it won't actually be clickable again until like the alert goes and the timeout is done, type of thing. So I feel like that's a pretty cool touch. They let it set for like 500 milliseconds, I think that is, and then afterwards they'll set submitting for false so it's clickable again, and they'll say the alert with the JSON. So usually here's where you're gonna want to put, like, for example, if you're using Redux Saga and you have an action to send all of this stuff to your backend, this is where you would put that logic, or if you're just storing it in your backend, or if you want to display it or do something with that data, whatever you want to do with that JSON data, you would put the handler for that right in here. Obviously you can delete the alert and replace it with that. And then finally we have the render, which is where all the forms actually get defined. You'll see here we have submit form is submitting touched errors. Most of these are pretty simple. Submit form is just if we go back to where this is being called, I think it's in the button, it'll just this is passed in from Formic itself, so you just want to pass that in as an on click to your button and Formic will handle the rest. And if we go here, we can see here we have essentially, so we have our form, and then in each one, for each item here, for each field form item we have here, we have a box and then a field component. And I'll go back and talk about what MUI picker util provider is in just a second, but for now let's focus on this. So within each one of these boxes we have a field, and that field is essentially one input. So we say what the component is. You can see here for this component they passed in the wrapper of the text field with uppercasing. Don't worry too much about that. But then we have a couple of things here. We have the name, we have the type, and the label. So type is going to be the type that you would pass into a regular input that comes from HTML itself. So for example, if you pass the type into an input in HTML and you set it equal to password, it'll automatically create this sort of star variation where if you type anything, it doesn't show up. So that's what type is. Label is what the user will see as the input. So for example, if I were to change this to like your email, you would see that this would change to your email. This label would change to your email. And now the final thing is name. And this name is sort of really important because this is what correlates to the initial values array and what you'll find in the values array and the errors array itself. So you want to make sure whatever name you give to your field component, you're keeping it consistent with your initial values, your validation values, and your error values. That's pretty much all there is to the basic form components. You can see here they're doing a form control label for this remember me thing. So this, when you submit it, will come out as a true or false. If we scroll down to select, you'll see here it's sort of the same. We're giving it, if you see over here, it's sort of like a regular input, but we've passed in the select prop into the Formix field API, and what that'll do is it'll make it so it gives a little drop down, and then all you have to do is pass in the actual data itself, which is done by Material UI menu items. So if you remember this ranges object up here, this range has all the options in an array. So what they've just done is they've looped through every single one of those options and then created a menu item for it. And the value is going to be the option.value, and then the label is just going to be whatever the label object was here. So that's, I think, pretty straightforward. Now if we scroll down, we have the actual tags. Tags is extremely similar. They just didn't store it in their in a data object before looping through it. They actually just decide to manually one by one output these menu items. And you can see here that multiple is a prop that's being set to true, which is what causes you being able to select multiple of these at once, but it's very similar to select. If we scroll down, for whatever reason, they put the is submitting up here. So if you were to submit something, it would show up in the middle of there. But that's what this is. Sorry, that's what this is right here. That's that logic. So if is submitting is true, aka if the form is being submitted, then they're just going to show linear progress. If you're not familiar with this and syntax, it pretty much just means if everything on the left of the and is true, then display whatever's on the far right of it. Then we have our time picker component. So you can see here we're passing the time picker and what that'll allow us to do. And this is just an import, like we talked about before, that comes from up here. And what that will do is it'll pretty much just let you pick a time from a Material UI. This is the Material UI basic time picker UI. It'll just allow you to pick the time type of thing. Then if we scroll down, this is where we get to the sort of complex stuff when we get to the date pickers. So where was I? Up here. So right here, this date picker and these date pickers. So these look simple when you implement it, but they're a bit difficult to implement, because before you can implement it, you actually have to have this MUI picker util provider wrapped around your component, at least wrapped around the parent of wherever this form is. You can put it with all your other providers in index.js, but usually you want to that's where I would normally put it. You can put it wherever you want. It just has to be wrapped around this component. And essentially what this is for is if I were to submit this, you'll see that the date is in a very specific format, and there are a lot of different libraries that will allow you to customize what format you want your date time to be in. So what this does is when you wrap your application around in this MUI picker utils provider, and you pass in a specific date provider library function, a utils function for that library, it will format that based on that specific library. So in this case, we're using FNS. If we scroll up here, you'll see that's actually a dependency, date.io/date FNS, and we are importing the date utils like that. So without that, it won't actually work, and you'll get an error. And that's something I got confused upon for a little bit until I did a bit of Googling and found that out. So if you're using these date pickers or these date time pickers, you need to make sure you wrap your MUI picker util provider and choose whatever date utils format that works best for you. So it's pretty much the same for the date time picker as well. The only difference is instead of date picker, you're passing a date time picker. Then if we scroll down, we see all the toggle buttons. So these are fields. We've pretty much given it the component of toggle button group, which once again imported from Formic, very straightforward. And then you just put all the different buttons that you want here and all their values for it. And depending on what is picked, will be in the data at the end. And then finally we have Autocomplete. Autocomplete is a really buggy component from Material UI, which is probably why it lives in the lab. But essentially what it does is you pass in a giant array. You pass in a giant array of things, and when you type, it'll filter that array of things based on the title. So for example, if I start typing in the, it'll filter it down so only things with the in it will show up. Then if I put space and type in, for example, G, it'll only show probably The Godfather and anything else that starts with the G, which is surprisingly a lot of different things. It looks like they're storing all the data for all these movies in here. So that's where they're getting all that stuff in, and they're just passing it in straight up in the options prop for this. It's pretty complex. As you can see here, you have to pass in like a render input and then pass in all of this stuff. All obviously this is another example of one of those TypeScript types. You could just boop that out of there if you're pasting this into JavaScript and you want to use the autocomplete within the forum. And then, yeah, finally, we talked about the submit button, but that is what the end of it looks like. They make it disabled for when you are submitting. The on-click is the submit form like we talked about before that gets passed in through this render prop as well. So it's a bit weird. You have like one component with a bunch of really big props, and one of the props is like a render method. But like I said, the structure of it, once you sort of understand it, it's very easy to go on and build your own forms and add for it. A lot of the times you're going to just be using it for probably more simple things, I would guess. And even if you're using it for complex things, I think using Formic is a lot better than trying to build it from scratch. But that's pretty much it. Like I said, this code sandbox link is going to be in the description so you guys can play around with it. And yeah, like I said before, if you found value in this video, please consider smashing the like button, leaving a comment or subscribing. I try to read every single comment. I love interacting with you guys. This video, like I said earlier, was from someone that left a recommendation. So I do read the recommendations and I do try to go in that direction. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hope everyone's staying safe and hope you guys have an amazing weekend.